All right, I'm going to use a mechanical or construction method here when laying out the head. And so these will be very mechanical shapes. There's going to be a lot of architecture involved in the layout. This is a means of illustrating, and the kind of illustration that this references is a different kind of illustration than, say, editorial. Editorial illustration has its own uniqueness to it that doesn't really necessitate a technique that's going to get you consistency and likeness and consistency and realism. In fact, a lot of editorial illustration doesn't look realistic at all. It has a very comical or cartoony feel to it or whimsical feel to it because a lot of the time the subject matter is pretty heavy duty. And when you can depict it in a different light rather than a realistic way, it's easier or it's more palatable to take in the information. So I've established the skull shape. I put in the side plane. That little circle on the side plane represents the side of the cranium. It's the beginnings of the jaw, thus the line that comes down the middle vertically. The horizontal line through the middle of the circle represents the edge where the top of the ear and the top of the eye sockets would go. So the tilt of the head is important to understand so that that angle in the back tips in the right direction, putting the ear in the correct orientation with the eyes when the head is looking up or down. The top of that circle represents the hairline, and the bottom of that circle represents somewhere where the bottom of the ear and bottom of the nose finish or terminate. And when you look at these thirds and the shapes that have been designed here, there's a lot of reminiscent elements of the Riley method. You could basically say that all of these construction methods of sorts for illustrators have similarities to them through and through. They all share a lot of things in common with each other. They've just been created in different camps of thinking, but ultimately everybody's goal is the same in realism, to create something that's convincing, that feels believable and feels almost photographic in a sort, although in some instances we'll put our stylization to it. All right, so after all the rest of the construction of the face has been put in, the nose plane, the tooth cylinder, the forehead, the glabella, that triangle between the nose, or between the eyes along the top of the nose, then I'm placing the shadow patterns over the top of these constructs. And bad me, I should have the neck drawn in here at this point, but I don't. I got a little ahead of myself. Usually do when I go into my own drawings, if I'm not drawing for a class, which this is supposed to be, but I feel like when I get in front of this camera, I'm kind of drawing for myself since I'm an audience of one. And I slip every now and again from my pathway that I intended. As in almost all of these video DVD demonstrations so far, I've kind of deviated a little bit here and there from my pathway. It's the joy of drawing, people. You get into drawing and you love it so much, you just can't help but just keep going. I need the whip cracker over my back to keep me in focus. The tonality of this model, she is of an ethnic type, and so her skin is much, much darker. The shadow pattern is an important thing to establish early on, but I think more important than the shadow pattern is to get the skin tone the correct value before relating everything else. If the shadow pattern goes in before the skin tone itself, without any skin tone in there, I had a shadow pattern in first, but I've been putting in the halftones too. So I'm able to see the distinctions in the values. But if you start with your shadow pattern and you make it too light, then there's no room to darken the lights. And when you do, then all of a sudden the shadows go away. And I see a lot of students do that when we're drawing ethnic types. They'll put in the shadows and then they'll start to put in the lights, and they'll make the lights really dark. And the shadows and the lights blend together, and all of a sudden the light's gone, and they question what happened when they put in something and it went away. Why did it go away? It's interesting because if they're not paying attention to their own handy craftsmanship there in front of them on their own pad, then they won't recognize the error that they're making, and they won't recognize that they have done something wrong. They assume that it's something else, and it's a very, very common problem with many different students. What happens, I think, more than anything else is that I was going along this certain pathway, and then all of a sudden I found myself on a different path, and I don't know what happened. Can you explain? I think that's what's going on in their mind. I hope so. Because to not recognize that they did it themselves, that's interesting. It's very interesting, but it is interesting that it happens on a common basis. So I'm thinking about two different tones, the local tone and the shadow patterns, and I'm thinking about them simultaneously. So one feeds on the other as I put them both in. Now on top of that skull shape, I'm going to be applying the hair mass. And her hair is cut close in the back to her skull, and then it's raised up a little bit on top. So now, yeah, a neck is important to put in because this is going to be the balancing point with what goes on the top of the head. Without seeing where the shoulders and the neck go underneath the head, I have only my guess to go by when I put the hair shape on top of the head. So now seeing this shape in context to the neck really does help out whether or not it's the right proportion, whether or not I put the angles in the correct spot. And I can see that things are going pretty well. I might shave a little bit off here and there with the eraser, but for the most part, everything's been constructed well. There's balance in the drawing from above to below. Now I'm continuing on with the skin tone, and that's really important because once that hair goes in, that hair is going to be a darker value. But I have to think about dark hair in the light. So that also means that the hair is going to be brought up in value so that it looks lit, and then the darker areas can feel like they're in shadow. There's competition with tone all over this drawing, and I just have to really keep an eye on that so that no one tone goes any darker than any of the others. That could throw the balance of the drawing off completely. And you can also see that the darker I go with all the local values and the shadow patterns, the more the tones that I place on the drawing now envelop all the line structure and make it go away. The only line that's really stayed put is the center line on the face, and I think it's just because I drew it a little darker than I should. But now I have all these planes that I'm cutting out in the face. I do need to think about a few things. One, I am drawing a female, so these planes should not become so chiseled that she becomes a weightlifter of sorts with a bunch of masculine forms. Two, I have tone that I'm working with, and I can't lose the contrast between the light and the dark. No matter how far away from the light source I get, that contrast can't be unbelievable. And I feel right now in the neck that I have a little bit of a problem with the contrast, where in the face I have a stronger established contrast between those 2 points. But again, it's about focus, and where am I going to emphasize the focus, and where am I going to play things down so that other things do not end up competing with the center of interest in the picture. I'm also drawing with a regular pencil now. Several of these drawings on all of these DVDs, I've broken my pencils and I had to work with a nub. And it just is so frustrating when that happens. But you don't stop, you just keep going. Unless you've just shattered your pencil entirely and you don't have any hope left. Because you're getting inspired. Once you're on your way and you're bringing in good shapes and good values and you're enjoying the moment, you don't want anything to happen like a pencil snapping or whatnot. So I think in this drawing what I did was I set aside a couple extra pencils just in case, and I didn't end up having to work with my fingernail again. All right, so I'm moving into the center of interest, and I'm building out the dark shapes. The hair, the shadow patterns under the nose and the mouth, underneath the jaw, all of those shadows were important to put in first because they are the boundary between my focus and everything else within value. Edgewise, everything's really soft right now. I only have a few crisp edges in the picture, one of them around the edge of the nose, the other one's back here in the ear. And I can get away with sharper edges in the ear because all of it together is going to be masked over with darker values. So the contrast between the lightest points and the darkest points will not be as great as it is right now. And here I'm going ahead and dropping the values. And you can see that those sharp edges really aren't competing with, say, the sharp edge under the nostril on the nose right now. That clearly is the sharpest edge. And the highest point of contrast in the corner of the eye socket. That clearly is the highest point of contrast. The ear has been completely stepped back so that it doesn't compete. And I try to make sure, which I don't always do because sometimes I tend to forget this, but I try to make sure along the way as I'm drawing that I knock every edge back a little bit. As sharp as I make it, I'll go back over the top of it with the eraser and knock it down a notch, just so I can remind myself that sharp edges are not the importance here, but gathering up shapes, assembling them, and then blending them together is the job that I'm looking for in the first part of all of this detailing. Then I can come back in and build sharper edges, build focus, higher points of contrast, smaller gradations, little details, all the other bits that take it towards a finish. This drawing is still sort of in its middle phase of the construction, the first part being the largest shapes, the second part being the established middle-sized shapes, and in a portrait that would be the shapes of the features and the shape of the hair. And then I ramp down into the smallest parts of the face, or the details of the face, the things that make us see clearly the reality of it, or the realism of it. Because in the silhouette, you should, if you know the person, be able to see it right away. You don't need, or you shouldn't need, those small details to understand who it might be if you know who the person is to begin with. I wouldn't expect any of you to go, oh, this is Joy, because if you don't know Joy, then you don't know who this person is at all. And the shapes don't matter. But they do matter in the drawing, because regardless of who it is, whether we know them or not, if they're not placed correctly, if they're not drawn correctly, those are the things that we're usually going to spot first and question. Rather than the rest of it that might look great, we're going to pick apart the thing that doesn't. It's part of the human condition in looking for fault, looking for details, sticking with details, and also being very nitpicky because of the advent of the detail and the necessity for us to strive for it. Don't forget your wallet. Don't forget your keys. Don't forget this. Don't forget that. Did you count all your pennies? And blah, blah, blah. We live in details, and we love them. We absolutely love them. But those are not the things that make the likeness. It should have started with the big picture first. The details are there just as supporting actors. So you can see also when I'm drawing, I'm constantly going around the drawing, erasing things away, putting things back, softening things down. I'm not focusing all my efforts in one space at one time. I'm sort of moving all about. It's important to remind yourself to do that, because the drawing will not solve itself in totality if you're thinking of it merely in pieces. As I put the picture together, I back up constantly, the part that you don't see because the camera is so fixated on the surface. But I back up constantly to look at the big picture, to relate the big picture to the model at a distance. And seeing both of them at a distance, I can really relate them both to each other more clearly than how we are right now, right up in the picture's space, that close in the battlefield. When we're that close, we really can't see the big picture at all, and we don't know if from the top of the head to the bottom of the neck, if we've related anything at all to the model out in front of us. From up close, all the shapes look just fine because we've looked at them individually and we've designed them individually, but do they fit together? And that's more important than seeing all those little things at all. Is the big read. Did you make the big picture work well for the audience? Do they relate to it? Can they get into it? Or have you made a mess of things and made it difficult, or make it difficult for the audience to get into the picture space at all? I'm using charcoal pencils, kneaded erasers, and that's about it. I do have a plastic eraser, but I haven't used it in this drawing because typically a plastic eraser is that last-ditch effort to get rid of something that's so ingrained in the picture space that it won't come loose. I'm trying to keep all the shapes very soft. I'm trying not to build out in an illustrated fashion, although we could say realism sometimes falls into the category of illustrated or graphic sometimes. And I can definitely say this, that in my training, I have learned from several different artists, several of them coming from schools of illustration and several of them coming from schools of fine art. The balance is finding how to make both of them work differently from each other, but at the same time complement each other in the way that they all fit together. How do the shapes work together? How do the tones gradate into each other together? So there's the softness from fine art, and there's the hard graphic qualities of illustration. And finding things with shapes is not a bad thing to do because you are actually looking at the architecture. It's keeping those shapes architectural and graphic that makes it less fine art looking. But I can say this, that I've seen a lot of fine artists in galleries and a lot of fine artists in the magazines that do things very graphically and call themselves fine artists. And then I've also seen illustrators do things very soft. Not the quick read or the big read, but a very subtle read, a very slow read, looking at the objects in a very slow fashion instead of fast. Illustration demands a quick read because we are flipping through things so quickly. Covers, bookshelves, in the magazines or books themselves, we're rifling through looking for things. We don't have time to soak in all the details, so illustrators need to rely upon the quick read, where fine art doesn't rely upon that because typically the quick read makes things very aggressive looking and maybe sometimes even harsh. When you consider the size of a painting on a wall and how big or how small that wall space is, the bigger that picture space gets and the more graphic that illustration, the further back you have to get from it for it to feel fine. Otherwise, it's very harsh and very cut apart to the eyes, and we don't necessarily see the big read or the big picture. All right, coming back to this, I'm now bridging the gap between the darkest darks and the lighter lights. Not the lightest lights, though. Those are around the eye socket. I'm trying to get the cheeks to roll. I'm trying to get the cheeks to roll into the neck, trying to get the cheeks to roll into the muzzle, and get more dimension out of the drawing. And then I'm going up into the hair now, and I'm trying to resolve the problem of light and dark within it. And you can see that I am making the hair lighter in some places so that it does feel like a light source is hitting it. We can't ever forget that just because hair is black doesn't mean that it doesn't have light and dark on it. The other little art trap that we can get really caught up in and we want to be careful of is not drawing texture too soon. Texture can usually break a picture. Texture is the detail. And the most extreme of details at that, especially with hair. I see a lot of beginning students drawing hair strand by strand. Oh, and look, another broken pencil. What did I tell you about the broken nubs? These pencils are good pencils, but at the same time, oh my gosh, they have cheapened in some way in their production. I have run into this over and over and over again, and as I said before about all these videos, I think almost every drawing I do on these so far, I've broken at least one pencil, if not several. Good odds, huh? Anyway, now that we're looking at this drawing, what I was doing around the backside of the head was softening the edge a little bit. I'm putting tone back there so that it creates a blurry edge of sorts. Then I'm going into the features, and I'm sort of doing the same thing with them. Because I'm drawing her face on a white background, I'm sharpening a few other edges up along their middle value range to keep her face graphic and sharp enough on the page. I don't want to lose an edge to the background in this instance because her skin is so dark. I think that would mislead the viewer into thinking that the skin is a lot lighter than it actually is. And on that far side of the face, I had a dark background against the model, so it wasn't bouncing an extreme amount of light back in. In fact, that far side is rolling into a shadow, so it is getting darker along that edge, but not visible enough to the eye to where the whole side of the face over there is in the dark. It's rolling into a halftone. So when I'm looking at both cheeks, I need to make sure that the cheek that I'm drawing on right now doesn't exceed the darkness of the far cheek. We want it to feel like it's closer to us. So there should be a wider range of light within it than letting it allow or bringing it all the way down and allowing it to drop into such a deep value range that it feels unlit. So now here are some of the shapes between the eyes that I want to be a little careful about because they could lead to a more masculine look, just as much as the cut line along the node of the mouth, which is that little furrow that goes up into the lip, the upper lip, that looks sort of like a mustache to some people. That little furrow could become such a shape that it could very well mislead the viewer into thinking that they're looking at a mustache. So another shape that needs careful play when being drawn out. So when I'm drawing these sharper edges, I'm not just scoring a line all the way across. I'm actually kind of dotting the line. It's keeping the line from becoming too constant and too sharp in the picture. And for last minute sake here, there's a few edges that needed to be beefed up a little bit to really help get some of the shapes to separate out a little better. The tooth cylinder and the side of the nose, for example, needed a little bit of a brighter contrast to show that they are lifted surfaces different from the cheek plane. And the highlight in the nose I felt was a little too bothersome. It was just a little too contrived and overstated, so I'm knocking that back as well and building out the ball of the nose a little stronger. I also feel that the face has too many planes in it, too many small surfaces that feel more masculine than not. So I'm using these washes of gradations, starting on one side where it's darkest, and transferring that value across the face from the darkest areas to the lightest areas. I'm allowing those gradations to help play the shapes up into each other and blur the boundaries between one and the other. That requires time. And a lot of shorter drawings we don't have that luxury of time to do so. So we're relying upon the illusions that we know how to create to hopefully inspire the effect. The far cheek was a little too cut out, so now I'm rolling the edge a bit more, trying to make it look like there is more dimension to it. And I'm playing the values up right up to the edge to eliminate the outline. The outline was put in to establish a crispness at the outside edge of the head, as well as establish a dark value that I'm trying to match in the tones being shaded up to it. That way, what I'm doing is I'm establishing what the barrier is and how I'm supposed to push everything else into that barrier and make them come together. I'm using the eraser much like the pencil. I'm using it as a rendering tool, and I'm hatching with it. And between the pencil and the eraser, my white paint, my black paint, all of the strokes that I put into the drawing should feel very similar to one another. We're losing a couple of the edges between the shapes, and of course eliminating all of the finger marks that I place because I'm resting my hand against the page, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. You don't have to have your hand elevated all the time, and for some of you, you might lose the dexterity. So for that instance, just go for it and put your hand on the page. But keep in mind that when you are using a cheaper paper like this newsprint, sometimes the marks are hard to eliminate because the oils of the skin embed them on the surface too much. The little details around in the mouth, I'm using the eraser to find, not the pencil. I don't want the shapes to feel cut out. I want them to feel blended. And the eraser is the better tool of both to make that judgment. At least what I've found is that the eraser is the better blending tool, and while the pencil is the better tool to cut things apart from each other. No matter how sharp the eraser, you'll never get as sharp an edge as you would with a pencil. You can just blister something with a pencil because of its rigidness and its darkness that it can produce so quickly. Sometimes I'll tap with the eraser like I'm doing there, and in tapping, I'm not getting rid of anything. I'm just knocking it down a little bit so it's not so dark and or textural. Which is something else here that I'm thinking about, the combination of textural versus smooth and the balance between the two. I'm letting the light be a little more textural, while the dark areas I'm trying to soften down a little bit so not everything competes in the same way. If you think about textural tones versus smooth tones, you almost have two entirely different ranges of value to work with. You have from 1 to 10 texturally and from 1 to 10 smoothly. So in reality, you have about 20 values to work with. Not 20 different values, but 20 total values. Which is quite a lot. And that's artists like Jean-Leon Gérôme and even Norman Rockwell took advantage of that concept. While they started things off very graphically and separate in their shape-value relationships, they applied a lot of light to the surface to create that illusion of realism, and that does require the maximum range of values possible. And the interesting thing enough is that they were pushing the maximum value range, and they were not going chiaroscuro the way Rembrandt was. And Rembrandt doing chiaroscuro gives the same illusion of full value range, and it gives you the tools capable of pulling off something very realistic because you're going from a black to a white. So now I'm looking at the last few places here where the values feel a little broken, and I'm trying to group them together with tones. Pushing halftones into the places, smoothing the shadows out a little bit more, bridging the gap between abrasive shapes. Right next to the ear, there's more transition going back into the jaw, so it does need to feel softer than in the front near the nose, the mouth, and around the eyes, where the shapes should feel a little more cut out. Within the ear, however, you have smaller shapes, and we just saw instantly the ear go back in value. I must have drawn without the camera on there. Sorry about that. You didn't miss anything, though, just pulling a gradation across the face. And finally, the lines under the eyes. I want to be really careful about putting those in. They can age a model very quickly. They want to go in very soft and think about them as a large shape.